Welcome back to Secret Weapons. My name is Mark Johnston, and if this is your first time here, this is a YouTube channel where we do gear demos and reviews, as well as studio tips and tricks for leveling up your writing, playing, and production from the perspective of a guitar player working out of a studio. If that's the kind of thing that would appeal to you, please hit that subscribe button and stick around for future videos. Today we are taking a look at the Old Blood Noise Endeavor's Sunlight Reverb. So the Sunlight is the newest offering in Old Blood's cavalcade of reinvention. Over the last 2 years or so, Old Blood has been taking a lot of their kind of classic mono spin chip pedals and rebuilding them from the ground up in this stereo format, giving you access to things like TRS True Stereo in and out, MIDI controls, expression inputs, all manner of kind of increased quality of life and increased control over your kind of wide sound design creation. And for me personally, these have been really interesting and anticipated releases. I'm somebody who loved things like the original Black Fountain or the original Dark Star. And so to have these pedals come out in these kind of updated and reinvented stereo formats has been really welcome. But the Sunlight is an interesting offering from Old Blood as far as reverbs go, because typically speaking with Old Blood, their reverb line tends to be big ambient reverb with all manner of modulation kind of applied to it. Think reverb tail with pitch shifting or sample reduction or flanging kind of bolted onto that reverb tail. But with Sunlight, it's interesting because the dynamics and the modulation and the movement in this device, the call comes from inside the house on this one. And what I mean by that is this is not a reverb with some other effect modulation or texture applied to the trail, but instead what you have is this really wide, big ambient reverb fed into a delay, more on that, and then with a internal LFO that can be assigned to different parameters of the reverb to create motion, either dynamically or consistently. So let's explain what I mean by that. You have this big reverb controlled by your decay control, your wet control, and a frequency control. And then that is fed into a delay line controlled by a time control and a feedback control, basically giving you access to what you can think of as a pretty exaggerated version of pre-delay that also has a feedback control, giving you access to a bunch of interesting ambient, less ambient, and much more ambient delay and reverb textures. But from there, you have this internal LFO controlled by rate, depth, and shape. And the shape is going to be obviously the waveform shape of the LFO, things like sines, squares, sawtooths, and even a random LFO. And then a rate control and a depth control. That rate can be either a multiplier control or a tap tempo set situation. And that LFO can be assigned to either the time for the delay, the frequency control, the EQ control over the reverb, or the wet mix of the reverb itself. That is controlled by these little buttons right here. And if you press them, these little knobs will light up, letting you know they're being modulated by the LFO. But what's interesting is that LFO can be acted upon itself. Up here, you have a dynamics control that notches at noon, and north of noon, it introduces a kind of envelope follower gate. So your input playing has to hit a certain threshold as defined by that dynamics control in order to create reverb in this thing, in order to open a gate into the wet channel to let reverb bloom out. And we made good use of that on the intro track in the form of that acoustic guitar part where I'm playing softly and there's no reverb playing and acting upon my signal until I embellish hard enough, at which case ambient reverb just kind of blooms out and spills into my signal. But counterclockwise, south of noon on that dynamics control, it takes your input playing dynamics and in conjunction with this rate control will either multiply or divide the speed at which that LFO is operating. So if you have your LFO as a sine wave modulating the frequency control open and closed, you can use your playing dynamics to either speed up or slow down the modulation rate of that filter control based on your playing dynamics. The harder you play, you can either have it speed up or slow down. And so the result is a very user-definable sense of movement and motion on your reverb, allowing you to get your kind of stereo width and your kind of movement in your reverb from pitch modulation via that time control, frequency modulation via that frequency filter control, or amplitude via that wet control, or any combination of all three. They can all be acted upon at the same time. And beyond that, you can also then modulate that LFO with your playing dynamics, giving you a moving reverb that will respond to your playing in really interesting ways. And if that all feels like a lot, it's because it kind of sounds like it is when it's just me talking to camera about it. So we're going to plug this thing back in and put it through its paces, starting by just taking a look at the shape and structure of the reverb itself, and then start digging into the ways in which you can act upon it. So let's give it a listen. So as always, before we get into our sound samples, let's talk through our signal chain and the context we're working in. I am playing my Jennings Navigator with McNally Stagger Swagger pickups into the 29 pedals Una, the Benson Germanium Boost, and the Milkman and Benson V-Amp amplifier. We're running into our preamps, which are the Maris 440 microphone preamps, using the effects loop on those to run mono in, stereo out to the Old Blood Bathing, to run stereo to the Sunlight Reverb, and then stereo back into our DAW, which is Pro Tools. This is what our dry tone sounds like. So we're going to start things off with the Sunlight by just taking a look at the kind of like character of the primary reverb itself, not so much digging into all of the kind of like modulation and movement stuff at the outset, but just getting a handle on the nature of the reverb in and of itself, as well as how it reacts to a mono input and a stereo input. Because as we've discussed, a lot of the motion comes from the built-in LFO here. So let's start by getting a hold of the reverb itself. So before we even start moving any knobs around and everything, something I want to point out is even though we are running stereo in, stereo out, you'll notice that we're getting a pretty mono sounding reverb right now. And that's because like with pretty much all the new offerings from Old Blood, these tend to operate in true stereo, which means what you send to left and right is going to be what is represented in left and right in the reverb, which also means that to get any sort of stereo movement from your reverb, you either have to increase the kind of modulation inside the pedal to create stereo movement or feed it something with a wider stereo signal. So to illustrate that, let's give a listen one more time to that mono sounding reverb with our mono sounding source. Bypass the pedal, and let's turn on Bathing, which we have set up right now as a fully wet stereo modulator. And now you can hear, let's turn that back off, turn Sunlight back on, and play that same part and then add in that kind of like width of stereo modulation from Bathing to show how you get a kind of much wider reverb sound from Sunlight as a result. As you can hear, all that stereo width and information comes from receiving stereo sources. But of course, running mono in, stereo out, or true stereo with a mono sound, you can still get width out of this, and we will get into that. So let's go ahead, and now that we've kind of understood the kind of mono stereo characteristics of the pedal, let's go ahead and turn some of the non-LFO based controls. So let's take a look at the main characteristics of the reverb itself in this thing. You basically have decay, which is the decay time on the reverb itself, and then you have feedback and time, and those are going to be a delay line that exists ahead of the reverb in the wet mix of this pedal, which means the further up you turn that time control, the longer the basically pre-delay that before your reverb hits is going to be, but with the added kind of complication of instead of it being a traditional pre-delay of just a kind of delay before the reverb hits, it's still a delay line, and turning up that feedback control will cause kind of repetitions in that reverb as well as kind of internal self-driven oscillation. So here is decay at minimum, feedback at minimum, time at minimum. And if we take that time to maximum, turn up that delay a bit. Or if we take our dry to minimum, so yeah, there's a tiny bit of room sound in there to just soften that up a little bit. So the interesting thing about the way that all this works is obviously you have the drag of a reverb right there. So if we turn up that feedback, or the drag of a delay, I should say, and you can obviously hear the delay character there by taking longer delay sounds and really minimizing the amount of reverb. And what this creates for you is giant reverb sounds. You can kind of go lower on the reverb itself. I mean, lower for an old blood ambient reverb, of course. And then take that to kind of like a medium delay line. But instead of having to kind of crank this reverb, you can instead crank your feedback. And of course, frequency is going to be the kind of tonal balance of the reverb. And you can move between different filter shapes in the pedal as well. Aux will allow you to freeze reverb in place. A lot of cool sounds in the reverb, even at bounce, or even from jump right there. Let's go ahead and start making this thing move all on its own. Or I guess really quick before we do that, just for fun, let's kind of pull up one of those same giant sounds, but with bathing in stereo ahead of it. Yeah, it's pretty great. Okay, let's create some movement in the pedal itself in some interesting ways. Starting things off, let's go at the kind of north of noon, which is going to basically be a dynamic envelope for your playing. And what that basically means is right now we are in a position where when I play, reverb comes out. Pretty straightforward. But as you move north of noon, you start to increase the threshold by which your guitar or your signal has to pass in order to activate reverb in this thing, in order for an internal gate to open up and allow your dry signal to trigger the reverb engine. So by turning this up, you end up with a thing that we used really heavily on that intro track, which is the ability to kind of play those acoustic parts in a way that are dry until you want to embellish them by leaning hard into the reverb. So this kind of thing. At extreme settings, you will get really, really dry guitar until you really lean in. Really cool for when you really want to kind of like accentuate a moment, but otherwise have a lot of control. So let's take a look at the dynamics control counterclockwise of noon. As you move counterclockwise, the signal strength of your instrument passing through the pedal will either speed up or slow down the LFO in here based on a combination of the rate control, whether it is a multiplier or a divider, and that depth control assigned to one of these parameters based on what you have lit up or everything lit up. And this is how you create stereo movement and modulation in mono, or in stereo, or just kind of general movement and modulation in mono. So let's go ahead and set our reverb up. And start with that tone control. So we can turn that on. And obviously, even before we kind of take this from noon, we are getting stereo movement now because this is being modulated by this LFO system, which can be tap tempoed or set with this control. And to kind of drive the point home, let's go ahead, take our dry tone out. And now, as we increase this dynamic control counterclockwise, as our playing kind of like intensifies, you'll hear the rate of that change. Giving you dynamic control over the kind of tonal balance or mix balance or whatever else of your reverb based on your playing. Same with your tone. Or not your tone, but your mix, your wet mix. So instead of opening and closing that filter or modulating that filter, you can instead modulate the kind of level of the left and right reverbs respectively, as seen here. Or we can have it so it slows down based on how hard you play. Or you can create modulation in your reverb by modulating that delay time. Let's go ahead and take that to a more subtle sound here. And of course, you have different wave shapes. And you can assign it to multiple parameters at the same time for like really interesting motion. And what's really wild about all of this is the fact that, like I said, it still runs as a true stereo pedal. So you can take this wild sound that we have here, and create giant width ahead of it with something like the bathing. And just for fun, let's also take a look at some of these frequency options for this control. So by holding aux and turning the frequency knob, we can select between different filter types from low pass, band pass, high pass, and band reject.